Here's something most people never stop to question. We live in the most advanced era of physical training in human history. We have biomechanics research, precision nutrition, recovery technology, and gyms on every corner. And yet, take 3 weeks off. Just 3 weeks. And most of that strength you spent months building begins to disappear. Now consider a Norse farmer warrior in 10th century Scandinavia. No gym, no protein powder, no periodization coach. He rows, carries, builds and hauls through decades of brutal winters. And his body, according to what archaeology has actually found in his skeleton, holds together well into his 50s. The question isn't whether he was stronger than you. The question is why his strength lasted, and why yours doesn't. This video isn't about glorifying Vikings or romanticizing the past. That would be too easy and, frankly, too dishonest. What it is about is a structural question. When you look closely at how Viking-age Scandinavians lived, the environment they endured, the labor they performed, the food they ate, the culture they operated inside, you start to notice something that modern fitness culture has quietly moved away from. Their strength wasn't a product they built in sessions. It was a property of how they lived. By the end of this video, you'll understand what Viking strength actually meant biologically, how the conditions of their world produced it without anyone intending to, why modern training produces strength that is real but fragile, and what structural differences in lifestyle, incentive, and environment explain the gap between strength that lasts a lifetime and strength that fades in weeks. Let's start at the beginning, with the world they actually lived in. Scandinavia in the 9th and 10th centuries was not a kind place to live. Winters in coastal Norway and Denmark ran 5 to 6 months. Temperatures stayed below freezing for weeks at a stretch. In December, you might get 4 hours of usable daylight. The ground froze solid. The sea turned dangerous. These weren't occasional hardships. This was just what life looked like, every year, without exception. Inside that environment, people worked, and not in the way we use that word today. Not commuting or sitting or typing. Physical work, the kind where your survival on any given day depended directly on what your body could produce. A Norse farmstead ran on 4 distinct cycles of physical demand. Spring, breaking frozen ground, repairing structures, moving livestock out of their winter shelters. Summer, the rowing and sailing season, when longship crews, often 30 to 60 men per vessel, sustained hours of coordinated, full-body effort across open water. Autumn, harvesting, slaughtering animals, and hauling food stores indoors before the cold locked everything down. Winter, cutting and carrying firewood, reinforcing buildings against wind and snow, and preparing for the next cycle. There was no break between them. One ended, and the next began. Here's what that actually looked like, activity by activity. Rowing. A longship oar weighed around 4 to 6 kilograms and was pulled against open water resistance for hours at a time, sometimes all day, sometimes on consecutive days. The movement loads the lats, spinal erectors, and glutes in a sustained, rhythmic pattern. The grip demands constant forearm and hand engagement. The foot brace position transfers force from legs through hips into the pull. In modern terms, it's somewhere between a rowing machine and a loaded carry, except the water doesn't give you a rest interval, and there's no target heart rate zone to stop at. Shipbuilding. A single clinker-built longship required hundreds of hand-split oak planks, each felled, shaped, and carried by hand. Structural beams often weighed over 100 kilograms. The work happened on uneven ground, with irregular loads, in changing weather. No fixed grip, no guided movement pattern. Every lift was slightly different from the last, which is exactly the kind of varied, unpredictable demand that builds connective tissue strength over time. Hunting and farming. A hunting trip in semi-Arctic forest might cover 10 to 20 kilometers on foot, across snow, over rough ground, with a carcass to carry back. Farming involved sustained squatting, lifting, and loaded carrying across the full growing season. Estimates suggest Norse subsistence farmers may have performed the equivalent of 6 to 10 hours of moderate to heavy physical activity per day across peak seasons. None of it was optional. Stopping meant not eating. Now here's where the archaeology becomes important. Studies of skeletal remains from Viking Age burial sites, including large collections from sites in Denmark, Norway, and the UK, consistently show the same physical signatures. Bone density well above modern averages, enlarged muscle attachment points called entheses at the shoulders, hips, and lower back, the places where tendons anchor to bone and where chronic load causes the bone to thicken over years of use. Joint surfaces showing wear patterns that start early in life and continue steadily into the 40s and 50s. Research on skeletons from sites like Valsgärde in Sweden and Trelleborg in Denmark found these markers not just in warriors, but in farmers, craftspeople, and women doing domestic labor. The load was everywhere. It touched every body. These are not the bones of people who trained hard in their 20s and then tapered off. They are the bones of people who were physically loaded for 30 or 40 consecutive years, and whose bodies kept adapting the whole time. Which raises the real question, the one this whole video is built around. What were the conditions that produced that kind of lasting physical adaptation? And what, specifically, is different about the conditions most of us live in today? Before we go further, we need to be precise about something. Because strength is a word that modern fitness culture uses very loosely, and the looseness matters. When a person today says they want to get stronger, they usually mean one of a small number of things. They want their bench press to go up. They want their arms to look a certain way. They want to perform better in a sport for a defined season. These are not meaningless goals, but they describe a narrow bandwidth of what strength can mean. Viking Age physical capacity, by necessity, had to operate across a much wider bandwidth. It wasn't enough to be strong in February if you were broken by August. It wasn't enough to have impressive upper body power if your joints couldn't sustain load-bearing work across decades. The strength that mattered in this environment was not peak strength. It was durable strength. Strength that compounded rather than decayed. Strength that was available not just when conditions were ideal, but when conditions were the worst they were going to be. Researchers who study functional capacity across populations distinguish between several components that tend to get collapsed into a single word. There's maximal strength, the absolute force a muscle can produce in a single effort. There's strength endurance, the capacity to sustain meaningful force output over time. There's structural integrity, the health of tendons, ligaments, and the connective tissue matrix that determines whether joints hold up under repeated load. And there's what some physiologists call work capacity, the total amount of productive physical output a body can sustain in a day, a week, a year, a decade. Modern training, as it is predominantly practiced and predominantly sold, optimizes heavily for maximal strength and for the aesthetic signals associated with muscular size. This is partly because those are the qualities that are easiest to photograph, easiest to measure in the short term, and easiest to market. Structural integrity, tendon and ligament health, is slow. It doesn't show up in a mirror. Collagen-based tissue adapts on a timescale of months and years, not weeks. And it is not, by any reasonable measure, the priority of most commercial fitness programming. Work capacity, the ability to sustain real physical output over long durations and diverse movement patterns, is even harder to sell. It doesn't produce dramatic before and after images. It accumulates gradually, and it requires exactly the kind of irregular, varied, sustained physical demand that a structured gym session, by design, eliminates. The training environment that most people use today is optimized for efficiency and safety, and those are genuinely good things. But efficiency means removing variables, standardizing loads, controlling range of motion. What you lose when you do that is the chaos that real-world physical demand imposes on a body, the asymmetric loads, the unstable surfaces, the unpredictable durations. And that chaos is, paradoxically, part of what drives the broadest and most durable adaptation. There's a useful framework here. Think of physical adaptation as a spectrum between specificity and breadth. Highly specific training, targeting defined muscle groups at defined angles with defined loads, produces rapid, measurable, visible results in those specific parameters. It is efficient in the short term, but it also creates a body that is adapted to a narrow range of demands. Remove those specific demands, and the adaptation begins to unwind, rapidly. Broad, varied, sustained physical demand, the kind that Norse subsistence living imposed continuously, produces slower, less dramatic adaptation in any single parameter. But it builds a body adapted to a wide range of loads, and adaptations that are built slowly across a broad range of demands over many years are significantly more resistant to decay. This is why 3 weeks off the gym costs you visible muscle and measurable performance. The training that built it was specific enough that when the stimulus disappears, the adaptation begins to unwind. The Norse farmer who spent 30 years carrying timber and rowing ships didn't lose his physical capacity in 3 weeks because his physical capacity wasn't housed in a training program. It was housed in his lifestyle. It was structural, environmental, cultural, continuous. There was no off-season, no deload week, no period where the demands of survival simply paused to let him rest. Now, this is not an argument that modern people should live without rest. Recovery is real, and the science on it is solid. But there is a meaningful difference between scheduled recovery within a life of continuous physical demand and scheduled training within a life of near-total physical inactivity. Most modern people, even those who train consistently, spend the overwhelming majority of their waking hours in a state of near-total physical inactivity, seated, sedentary, thermally comfortable, physically undisturbed. They then introduce 2 or 3 hours per week of intense, specific physical stimulus and expect it to produce durable, lifelong physical capacity. And it does produce something. It produces real adaptation, real muscle, real strength within its defined parameters. But it cannot produce what decades of continuous, varied, full-body physical demand produces, because it isn't that thing. It is a simulation of that thing. A compressed, efficient, commercially packaged approximation designed to fit inside a modern life that is, by every structural measure, the physical opposite of the environment that forged Viking-age bodies. This isn't a critique of gyms, it's a critique of expectations. If you understand that what you're doing in a gym is maintaining a baseline, fighting the entropy of a sedentary modern life, staying functional, staying health, that is an honest and valuable framing. If you believe that 3 sessions a week of isolation movements and protein shakes is building the kind of structural, lasting physical durability that a lifetime of genuine physical demand would build, then you are operating with a misunderstanding. And that misunderstanding has a cost. Not just in the gym, but in your joints at 50, in your grip strength at 60, in the question of whether your body is, at its structural foundation, built to last, or built to look good in the window of time when conditions are ideal. The Vikings didn't have that window. Their conditions were never ideal. And so their bodies, over generations and over lifetimes, adapted to something harder and something more honest than ideal conditions. That adaptation lasted. What the modern data actually shows, this isn't just ancient history. Modern research is producing data that maps almost exactly onto what Viking-age skeletal records showed us. The gap between durable strength and fragile strength isn't just visible in 10th century bones. It's measurable in living populations, right now. Start with grip strength. A 2015 Lancet study tracked nearly 140,000 adults across 17 countries and found that every 5-kilogram drop in grip strength was associated with a 17% increase in cardiovascular mortality, outperforming systolic blood pressure as a predictor of heart disease death. The same forearm strength Viking rowers built through decades of oar pull turns out to be one of the clearest biological markers for whether a body is aging well or deteriorating ahead of schedule. And that strength is declining. A 2016 Journal of Hand Therapy study found millennial men are about 20 pounds weaker in grip than men of the same age 30 years ago. Not a genetic shift, a behavioral one. Less physical demand in daily life, and the body quietly reflecting that absence. Then there's bone density. The CDC's NHANES survey found that roughly 10% of American adults over 50 have full osteoporosis, and another 44% have low bone density, osteopenia. That's more than half the population over 50 with structurally compromised bones. The primary driver isn't calcium intake. It's insufficient mechanical loading over time. Viking Age skeletal records showed the opposite pattern. Bone thickening at muscle attachment points that continued developing into the 40s and 50s, reinforcing rather than declining. We are the first human populations to experience structural bone loss in middle age as a routine expectation rather than a pathological exception. The same pattern shows up in muscle mass. Sarcopenia, age-related muscle loss, averages 1 to 2% per year after 50 in sedentary individuals. But studies of older adults in manual trades show substantially preserved muscle mass well into their 70s and 80s. The biology is real, but the trajectory is not fixed. It is, in large part, a consequence of how we live. And daily movement data makes the scale of the problem visible. The average American adult takes 3,000 to 4,000 steps per day, less than half what public health researchers associate with baseline metabolic health. A 2020 study in the American Journal of Preventive Medicine found that adults below 4,000 steps per day had significantly higher all-cause mortality than those above 8,000, even after controlling for structured exercise. A Norse subsistence farmer, by conservative estimates, covered 15 to 25 kilometers a day, not in one run, but in the accumulated, purposeful movement that keeping a farmstead alive demanded. Then there's VO2 max, the maximum rate at which the body consumes oxygen under sustained effort. Drawing on data from the Cooper Center longitudinal study covering over 100,000 patients, longevity researchers now consider it the single strongest modifiable predictor of all-cause mortality, more predictive than smoking, more predictive than diabetes or cardiovascular disease markers. The mortality gap between the bottom quartile and the top quartile is around 4 to 5 times. And VO2 max is not built by short bursts of intense training. It is built by decades of sustained aerobic demand. The multi-hour rowing efforts Norse oarsmen performed across their working lives were, biologically, one of the most effective things a human being can do for long-term health. They weren't doing it for that reason. They were doing it because the ship needed to move. The effect was the same. The gap between Viking Age physical capacity and our own is not a gap in intention. Most people who train do so with genuine commitment. It is a gap in structure. Researchers at the Pennington Biomedical Research Center estimated that Americans now burn roughly 100 fewer calories per day through non-exercise activity than they did in 1960. A small number that compounds silently across decades. In every hour of sitting, every elevator taken, every task automated out of physical existence. The point is not despair. The point is clarity. The honest question is not whether to go to the gym. It is whether the gym is enough. Whether 2 or 3 sessions a week, inside an otherwise sedentary life, can substitute for what the body was built, over hundreds of thousands of years, to receive continuously. The data says it cannot fully substitute, but it also says that adding broad, varied physical demand to a modern life, carrying, walking, lifting in varied patterns, sustaining effort across longer durations, moves the needle in the right direction, not toward a Viking's life, toward a more structurally honest version of your own. The question worth sitting with, the one this video was always building toward, is simple. What would it mean to build strength on those terms? Not to live like a Viking, that is neither possible nor desirable, but to understand what durable physical capacity actually requires, and to ask, honestly, whether what most of us are doing is building it. Their strength lasted a lifetime because it was never a program. It was a life.